I did want to ask you a little bit about, what drew you to helping make changes in the environment?
I've always been someone who's enjoyed the outdoors and nature, and when I was in college, I began to learn about the ways that people were affecting the environment. I became interested in law. I became interested in the ways that the law was regulating how people interacted with the government, and actually went into environmental law for about 15 years before I joined the San Diego City Council and started my political career. But even then, I've maintained an interest and a focus on environmental issues throughout my time in Congress, at the port, and now in Congress. The city, at the port, and now in Congress. I started to learn early on about climate change, and back then it was quite theoretical. But I don't know if President Carter had actually proposed a 50-cent a gallon gas tax to deal with climate change, and I said, "What's this all about?" So I started to study it a little bit and think about how human activity and human growth affects the natural environment, what that means, what are the trade-offs for that. How can we protect what's important? How can we allow development and growth and prosperity? And how can we have both?
What did you see during your years as an environmental lawyer? What kind of changes did you see make a difference in the community?
I worked on some of the first Superfund cleanups in the Midwest. And the thing about that law was it was a so-called strict liability law, which meant that if it was yours, you had to clean it up. Even if you did all the right things and it fell into the wrong place, you had to clean it up. So there's a lot of work to try to rehabilitate a lot of places that were contaminated so that they would not be threats to the community and they would be actually usable. And I really found that work kind of rewarding to get those cleanups kind of done. Then I did some work on Clean Water Act and helped establish some new laws around shipyards to make sure that they had to capture their runoff so that it wouldn't go into the bay. We were successful there, and then I did some work on waste disposal, make sure that landfills contain waste, and that's what actually got me into public service, because taking care of trash is one of the basic functions of a municipal government. That's kind of how I learned about the city and the county and what they do.
And you thought, I can be more impactful?
I thought, first of all, the people serving at the time at the Board of Supervisors when I was working with the county were very good people. I thought that I was trained in some ways that might really be helpful. So when my city council seat came up and we were having an average of a sewer spill a day back in the late 90s, I thought, this is something for an environmental lawyer. So I talked to my wife, I took a big pay cut, started knocking on doors and got elected to the city council, ultimately became the city council president. And we got to our sewer system, by the way, to a place, this was a success, where on clear days in the summer, it's a pretty safe place to swim. Now, of course, I'm working on cross-border sewage spills from Mexico. We've got some work to do there, but I kind of think I have an ability to work with those problems.
Move forward, a couple decades.
Right.
What are you trying to push for now?
So at a really important point in the nation's response to climate change. Last Congress, with President Biden, Congress set aside over $360 billion to incentivize changes in the economy and to build things that would address climate change, in addition to an infrastructure bill, a $1.2 trillion bill. And now we're on offense. So if you think about the laws of the 1970s, the environmental laws of the 1970s, they were on defense. They were trying to stop bad things from happening, whether it was emissions into the air, into the water, or building something really stupid and uninformed. And those laws really worked well for that time. But think about today. To deal with climate change, we have to triple the size of the electric grid if we're going to decarbonize everything and electrify it. Triple the size of it. That's 200,000 miles of wires. We're building like 18,000 a year at this point. We've got to build utility-scale solar. We've got to build hydrogen pipelines, offshore wind farms. And all of these things need permits, and they have to happen fast. If they don't happen fast, two things will happen that are bad. One is we will lose the benefit of all that money we put aside. All the taxpayer money that we put aside to deal with these climate issues will be wasted. And the other thing that will happen is we will not have reached the numbers that we've hoped to reach in terms of reducing greenhouse gases. So now the environmental movement has got to talk about how to make things go faster, not how things should go slower.
People are buying more electric vehicles, for instance, on a scale that where people can make an impact. But the infrastructure is It's still kind of very skeleton-like.
Yeah, if we don't have the infrastructure to support that, and the heat pumps and electric stoves, everything that we talk about, wanting to promote, we will have real reliability problems. So that's why, for us to really achieve our climate goals, we have to move faster, and that's why the permitting laws, the environmental laws, have to be revised.
Tell us about NEPA.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't know about it.
The National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, is the law that requires you to look at the impacts of what you're going to do, consider alternatives, and if people don't like the answer that you give them, it gives you an opportunity to sue, which can take for many, many years. There's a California analog called CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. These are designed to require public input before a decision is made to make sure that the government understands the environmental impact of the thing it's about to approve and has considered all the alternatives. And it's a great process. We owe NEPA a lot of credit for saving things that are important to us from an environmental perspective. The problem is that it's the most litigated federal environmental statute. The report can take 4 years to consider. When you add on the lawsuits, it's years and years and years of delay. That discourages investment, but also keeps you from getting things built in time. And that's what I'm saying. In the environmental world of today, the environmental action world of today, we've got to build those transmission lines pretty fast. And I'm not sure we can do that with project-by-project litigation. And we've become used to that. We've become used to development being a land of lawsuits. And if we're going to achieve climate action, we've got to rethink that as environmentalists.
So these laws were made in 1970?
1970, the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, was enacted and signed into law in 1970. 165 members of Congress weren't even born. I was. But 1970 is as far away from today as 1970 was from 1917. It's a very old law, and it didn't come from Moses. It came from people just like me who are trying to do the best thing they could do in Congress. And now it's our job to adapt those laws to the challenges of today, which is how to make things go faster, not slow them down through litigation.
Why is there so much resistance to changing this law?
People are nervous about change, and we're used to this process. Around sometime in the 1960s, we became very suspicious of big government, and a lot of folks decided that maybe suing the government was the way to make sure that we were holding it accountable. And I understand that. On the other hand, now we've gotten used to a situation where things can't get built on time, and we're spending so much taxpayer money on process. And I guess if you're just you're not worried about housing developers, I mean, I know they're frustrated with it, but now we're talking about environmental challenges. So it's just become the norm, and people are used to the norm, and they're wondering, like, what would it be like if we weren't able to take every transmission line to court? And I think we're going to have to let go of that a little bit. We're going to have to trust the people that we elected and the government of the people, by the people, and for the people to make some of these decisions to move forward without litigation at every turn.
So most of our viewers probably have no idea what goes on behind the scenes and what it takes to get a project done. They just want the best fuel-efficient car.
Right,
they want to try and do their part to reduce their carbon footprint. So they don't see everything that goes on behind the scenes. So you're telling me that every time there's a project, there's a ton of litigation that has to go into making sure this project is checked and balanced,
Yeah,
and that's not
norm.
the way?
That's the norm. We should make a plan nationally for how the grid should be built out. We should argue about that. We should get a lot of public input. We should argue about we should have lawsuits about it at that stage. But once we have a plan set, then we need to implement the projects. And I think we need to do that free from the delays of litigation project by project. Because at this point now, that's become an environmental concern. But that is what's happening today. It takes 10 years to build one transmission line. And if we don't triple the size of the grid in 30 years, we will lose 80% of the climate benefit of that $360 billion that Congress appropriated last Congress. And that's not acceptable.
10 years because of the litigation?
It's 3 years of construction and 7 years of process. That's just not way. So I represent an area. So the Navy's trying to redevelop the NAVWAR project, which is it's one of the Navy brain centers, and if you drive down Highway 5 to the west of Highway 5, there are those tilt-up buildings along there that were a bomber factory. It was a bomber factory in World War II. And the men and women who worked there turned out a bomber an hour.
Wow.
There was no litigation over that. We just decided as a nation that was an imperative that we would do. We would figure out how to do it and we would get it done. That's the mentality we need for climate action today.
At the rate we're building transmission lines today, how long will it take to get what we need?
Well, we will lose if we go at this rate. In the last 10 years, North America has built 7 gigawatts of interregional transmission, just for a number. I don't have to tell you what that is right now, but say half of that's the United States, so at 4. South America has built 22. Europe has built 44. China has built 260.
We've built 7.
We've built 4 in the United States.
We've built 4.
7 in North America. That's the pace we're going at now. And I would just want to, this is a break the glass emergency moment, right? If we're talking about climate as an emergency, that is unacceptable. And we've got to do better. So we've got to not just change NEPA in the litigation process. We've got to figure out ways to get these things processed much faster so that construction can occur. If we don't build the grid out and triple it, according to Princeton, we will never make our numbers, and 80% of the benefit of all that $360 billion that we just put out in the last Congress, from a climate perspective, will be lost. That's not acceptable from an environmental standpoint. That's not acceptable from a taxpayer standpoint, and that's why I've been sort of talking about this recently.
So what are you trying to do?
What I would like to do is to come up with a permit system that would let us do these projects without project-by-project litigation. More certainty up front. And we should, by the way, I don't want to reduce environmental review, I just want to get it done more quickly. I want to get it done as a program so that when we put in line by line, that would already be part of the plan we understand. We're not going to get in the way of the deployment of that plan. It seems simple. I think, just think that there's a lot of entrenched habits that people are in. It's hard for them to imagine a different way. But those same people are the ones that say that climate change is a crisis, we have to act now. I'm serious about that.
Do you know how much money is spent litigating these issues along the way during every construction project?
Marcel, I would say I don't have that number. I think that a lot of the cost is not just in the money spent, but in the delay, the years it takes. Because the courts, are busy, and the years it takes to get through the courts costs us progress, costs us jobs, and it's going to cost us environmental progress.
So tell me what NEPA does to allow this long process to take place, and how would you change it?
So we're going to have a lot of conversations about exactly how to change it, but right now the process is you'll do an environmental impact study,
Sure.
or EIS. In California it's called Environmental Impact Review, or EIR, that will assess the project. As things have gone by, these things have become, these reports have become extremely detailed. You have a period of comments, formal period where it's open for comment, then you have a period for response, then you have a final draft EIS. It goes to the government to be approved. Right now, the federal government doesn't always just designate one part of the government. It can get kicked around among various other ones. One thing we should do is sort of designate for each kind of project the place where the federal government will deal with it. We should give them a deadline. There's no deadline on how long it takes them to review. And then when they do make a decision, a record of decision, that can be sued under the theory that either you didn't consider the alternatives or you didn't consider all the impacts. And that's where the delay, again, gets extended. So all of these things need to be tightened up. I don't think there's really any world in which we can't imagine high environmental standards achieved in a quicker time. It just takes too long.
10 years is not acceptable.
10 years is not acceptable for one line. When we have to do, as I said, we have to do 200,000 miles of power lines.
And how many?
The last 10
How
years,
many miles
18,000.
is one line?
Well, it depends, but last
Okay.
10 years we've done 18,000. 10 years. We need to do 200,000. So the scale of this, from people who say climate change is an existential threat, we need them to say, let's get on the ball and get moving. Like using an abacus when you could use a calculator.
There you go. I don't know how many people would know what an abacus is anymore these days.
Oh, that's funny. It's funny.
Do you
So
have
I have this. This is what I have. So this is a slide rule. Did you ever use a slide rule? Okay. So I don't remember how to use this, but when I was in 11th grade, this is how you did really these hard calculations, and you were able to move things by and line it up here like this, right? And I love having this because when I was in 11th grade, some kids could afford a calculator because they were hundreds of dollars. Hundreds of dollars. I mean, now, if you even bought a calculator, it's $5. So, but now this is a trophy, right? This is a thank you for your continued support of fundamental science. This is such a relic that it's a trophy, right? And that's how we got to get out of this mentality that this kind of slow technology is okay. This is not the technology of today, nor are the laws of the 1970s.
They were great then.
They were great then, but they don't meet the challenge of today. We have to change them.
So what's your act? What are you?
So this has to be bipartisan. So we are in conversation with a lot of Republicans and Democrats about how we could achieve high environmental standards in a much quicker way. I think that there's a general sense among Democrats that, yeah, we know things have to change. We're just not sure about how that would be. Republicans say we know things have to change. We don't want to scare off the environmentalists. We want to really do want to perform. And I think that goodwill approach from both sides can result in some really good change.
And you're, of course, going to wrap in the environmental groups that have a lot of say in things.
Of course. I mean, I think that that we would love them to help lead this process. So far, I think they're really nervous about it. And I think, they're used to a process that's evolved from the 1970s when, again, a lot of them weren't even born. This is the norm for them. And we have to figure out a new norm that's climate sensitive.
People are resistant to change.
I've always said there's only two attitudes about change. There's one group of people who are deeply skeptical, and the rest of them are all absolutely opposed. So you just have to deal with that. That's how people are. Even when they know that something's better, it's a huge risk to do something differently. But our job as legislators and as leaders is to bring them along and make sure we come up with something that's good. So we'll engage with everybody now and throughout this whole process to make sure that we're getting the right results. But at the end of the day, we've got to take these climate actions with taxpayer money in a way that means something. We can't waste the money and leave it in a bank account instead of putting it into the ground.
Let's talk in layman's terms. Like, how is this going to affect my family, your family, 10, 20 years from now?
Well, I mean,
if things don't change.
Right. If things don't change, you might be in a neighborhood that has a lot of particulates and asthma because we're still using dirty energy. I can't replace that plant unless I get a lot of transmission. I can't get that transmission in time unless we reform these laws. So I can't get you cleaner air unless we do all this work, right? If you're concerned about the cost of natural gas, we got hit this year, right?
Sure did.
Wouldn't you like to have alternatives in place? I think the more different kinds of energy we have, ultimately that will bring down the price. That will provide better security for consumers and for the United States, not having to rely on the president going to Saudi Arabia or Venezuela and asking them to send us more oil. I mean, but I can't do that without more transmission lines, without offshore wind, without hydrogen pipelines. So your interest in this is that as an ordinary person is, you shouldn't have to worry about the details. But you should know that someone's not going to waste your taxpayer money. And you should know that people are working to save this planet for your children. And that's what it's all about. But I think, again, you're sort of stating the problem is we assume everything the government does takes time. Well, why does it take so much time? Now it's not getting the money. The money's there. We got a ton of money there to help build out solar, to help build charging stations for electric cars. What is it? It's the permitting. It's the siting. It's the litigation. It's the arguing. We have to figure out a way to cut that out. And we have to figure out a way to think of ourselves, again, as a country that can take action, the kind of country that sent someone to the moon, the kind of country that built a bomber an hour in the Midway District. I mean, that's what we have to get back to. And it means really cutting out a lot of the delay that we built into this process because we're scared to act.
Do you understand the critics' concerns?
So I've been in politics now 20-some years, 22 years. And here's what I find is that if no one's complaining, you're not making change. It's only when you come up against the grind of resistance that you realize, okay, now we're getting somewhere because people are noticing a change. And so that is totally normal. And by the way, it's my job to have to answer those questions, right? Those people are my bosses in aggregate, I report to them. And they should be nervous about change. They should be nervous about conditions on the ground, and whether it's homelessness or housing development at the local level or this kind of thing at the federal level. Change is going to produce friction, and that's okay. It's also, I told my staff, that's a natural state. We're just going to have to work through it, make sure we can answer all the questions, because people will raise good questions we hadn't thought about, and that at the end of the day we'll come up with something that's responsive and meets the challenge of today.
10 years from now, if we do another interview and we look back to what is starting in 2023, what do you hope to be able to reflect on?
I hope people say, wow, thank God we did that. Look at how great this is going, right? I hope so. And I hope that people really understand the seriousness of this challenge in a way that I think we can say from here, but we don't feel here all the time. And I think that's what we're trying to meet. So I hope that people understand it better. And that's partly my job, but make sure that we explain it right. But the hope is that we can solve this problem. We don't have a lot of time to solve the problem, and we're just one country too. We have to lead the rest of the world. But part of this is setting an example for everybody else too.
What is the timeline?
Well, we basically have to reform the energy system by 2050. So that people say that we have to, become net zero. So by 2050. That means, stuff we have to start right away. We have to start right now. And I think it's going to be a better quality of life for us. It's going to be difficult for us to change, but we'll have more abundance. We'll have more security in terms of energy. It will be a more reliable, more diverse energy system. But there's a lot of grinding and a lot of detail that has to go in along the way. And that's, I think, our job to make sure in Washington that we're pushing that along.
I can sense your passion. What fuels you? Try and get this pushed through. I'm so lucky to have this job. I think the thing that I have as experience as a trial lawyer, I've seen kind of how to manage conflict and how, if you have the right case, you can make the case to the jury. And this is the thing. I think I don't see a lot of other people jumping on this inside the Congress. And I think it's really important for me to raise the issues. So far I have about 10 or 12 Democrats who said to me, I'm not ready to be public on it, but I want to help you. Let me know how this is happening. I've got really good friends on the Republican side who want to help me with it. They know they don't want to scare off the environmentalists. They want to treat this really seriously. So what it fuels me is the ability to work to serve my community and solve these problems in a really constructive way. That is kind of why I do this job. That's why I get on a plane from San Diego, which is a much nicer place, to Washington, D.C. I don't go for the weather. Spending 15 years as an environmental lawyer in environmental law gives me a background in making environmental law that I think is pretty helpful to the Congress, and I hope that I can be constructive and come to a solution. I can't imagine we can achieve our goals with NEPA as it is, so I think at least it has to be amended. Maybe there's a new process that we can use to get public input that's even more creative. And one of the things that people don't realize about NEPA is that about 90% of the comments that come in through that process are from corporations. It's really not just empowering low-income people who don't have lawyers. And so I think there's ways to solve the problem that are more elegant and more quick, and I think we have to come up with those. And then whatever that is, we will put into a law that will retain the best parts of NEPA and fix what needs to be fixed. So how long do you have? What's your next step?
We are continuing to talk to a lot of people who do research on this, academics who've looked at NEPA and the permitting process and have concrete ideas about what to do. We're doing outreach to our colleagues about how they might be helpful to educate them. Not everyone practices environmental law, obviously, right? I mean, that's just my background. So we've got to educate our colleagues about what might work better. And we'll work with the environmental groups and members of the public to make sure that we get something that gets it right. But we got to let the facts drive here. And the facts are what I told you, that if we don't do these things in time, we will lose the benefit from a climate perspective and a taxpayer perspective. All this money we've set aside, it would be a tragedy and an outrage.
Do you have to use that money in a certain time frame?
People won't invest in a solar plant that can't be hooked up to the grid, right? So if there's no grid, the grid's not sufficient. And by the way, if we don't fix the grid, we're going to face reliability issues anyway, right? So 9 states had brownouts or blackouts
We were
around
right
Christmas
there,
last year.
teetering.
We had issues. Texas had issues. Those are all related to the reliability of the grid. And you can't put ornaments on a tree that can't stand up. So and we have to fix the grid. So all of it depends on getting the grid right. I think we have to have a pretty good idea of where we are by the summer, so we can make sure that we get legislation introduced through the committees. Unfortunately, what happens too is there's a point at which the presidential election will take over all the discussion. That's good and it's bad. It's good because now, people kind of leave us alone. We can do our work. But it's bad too if we can't get the attention we need to get things passed in a bipartisan way. That's why I think doing a bipartisan bill is most likely to survive and thrive in the middle of a presidential campaign.